I wasn't supposed to find this. I didn't break anything to get in. The north transept of St. Aloysius was already collapsing, and the contractors had forgotten to chain the iron gate after the last storm peeled back half the roof. I'd been hired to catalog surviving religious art for a historical salvage grant. Simple gig. Photograph some grotesques, jot down dimensions, maybe interview the last priest alive who remembered its bells ringing. But on the third day, I found the cavity in the wall. It was behind the old sacristy, where mildew curled the wood like burnt paper and the floor slanted just enough to make your knees ache. A half-loosened stone fell free when I leaned against it to take a photograph of the shattered stained glass. The sound it made wasn't the hollow thud of rot, it was clink. Deliberate. Heavy. Inside, a ledger wrapped in oilskin, buried inside what looked like a coffin-sized niche, charred along the edges. No insulation. No cross. Just crumbling mortar and the smell of something chemical. The ledger was wrong even before I opened it. The binding was tacky, like dried glue, or something more organic. Leather, yes, but not cowhide. The title branded into it had been mostly scraped away. Only 3 words remained blackened but legible in the candlelight. The Hollow Doctrine. The pages crackled like bark as I turned them. Most entries were written in the same angular, pricking script, not cursive, not quite print. The ink had a faint sheen, and some letters bled unnaturally into the parchment, like veins under skin. Names. Dates. Diagnoses? Elspeth Blaine. March 1, 1845. Refused the milk. Hollow signs began. Corinne Blaine. March 4, 1845. Removed from public lessons. Hollow advancing. Sylvia Blaine. March 5, 1845. Refuses sleep. Tongue split. Agnes Blaine. March 6, 1845. Petition for cessation denied. Observe stage 3. The Blaine sisters. 4 names repeated over and over. Sometimes scribbled into the margins, other times printed in a grid like they were being monitored or measured. No mention of a mother. No details of a father. No locations except Maine, parcel 73A. Parcel 73A doesn't appear on any of the maps I've found. The book ends abruptly on a blacked-out page. Burn marks eat through half of it, but I could still make out one last line before the paper crumbles between my fingers. Do not wake what was bound under the floor of St. Aloysius. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I saw their names etched on the inside of my lids, not in ink, but in scratches. Like someone had dragged their fingernails over the softest part of my brain. By morning I'd already started searching property records for 1840s Maine. Dead ends. Blaine is a common enough surname. But parcel 73A, that's not a name, that's a designation. Military or ecclesiastical. Institutional. St. Aloysius, according to the records, was never supposed to have a crypt. And yet I've found what looks like a sealed iron hatch beneath the altar, beneath the rot. The air around it is colder, even when the sun's high. I should report this. I should leave it to historians. Or police. Or exorcists, maybe. But something about the names, the way they were tracked, it's not just religious. It's medical. Scientific. Like a study that was never published. Like a sickness no one wanted to cure. I keep thinking about the phrase, hollow advancing. I'm not sure what that means. But I think I need to find out who, or what, made this doctrine. And why it was buried in a church wall. The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't a fluke. St. Aloysius wasn't just a crumbling parish with a sealed hatch and a ledger full of vanished girls. It was a relay point, a spoke in a wheel that had long since stopped turning, but never stopped watching. I found the first real thread at the Maine State Archives in Augusta. Buried under land acquisition filings from the early 1800s, there it was, parcel 73A, deeded to the Congregation for Mental and Moral Restoration, 1838. No public record of the congregation exists before or after that year. The land was designated for a private seminary for the correction of feminine unreason. The place was called St. Augustine's Seminary for Wayward Daughters. Officially, it was described as a contemplative cloister and scholastic refuge for girls of delicate constitution, prone to imagination, hysteria, or spiritual disruption. A sanitized euphemism for something darker. The kind of language men in powdered wigs used to describe children they didn't want to deal with. No census records exist from within the seminary walls. Only invoices, ledgers, medical requisition forms. Dozens of them. Always the same 4 surnames repeated. Blaine, Alcott, Hatherley. One other, too scorched to read. I found a faded pamphlet in the library's rare documents section. The cover read, "A Treatise on Hollow Virtue, Instructional Framework for the Education of Disordered Young Ladies." Authored by a man named Reverend Father Peregrine Sterling. He was the seminary's founder. Anglican by robe, Puritan by obsession. Born in 1765 in Boston, ordained in London, and returned to Maine after what one document cryptically called the incident at Lambeth. He was granted full ecclesiastical autonomy by the Crown to establish what he called a purgative pedagogy of the female soul. That phrase is carved in Latin over the seminary's gate, now broken and rusting in the woods off County Road 9. I found it after hiking 2 miles into an overgrown patch of land long since reclaimed by trees. The building is still there, just barely, skeletal, silent, cloaked in fog. No birds. No breeze. Just stone and cold. In the administrative files that survived, I found meticulous charts. Girls grouped into phases. Stages. Diagnoses with no medical basis. Notes scribbled in the margins. Sylvia has ceased vocalizing. Hollow process stabilizing. Maintain until equinox. Agnes exhibits inverted empathy, prays when others cry. Permits supervised exposure to subterraneum. There are no graduation records. No discharge notices. Just a final entry in a quarterly report from 1846. All 4 subjects have fully entered the doctrine. Observation chamber sealed. No further reports required. Sterling himself vanished in 1847. No obituary. No transfer. His last known act, according to church correspondence, was interring the blasphemous codex beneath Aloysius, under vow of silence. That codex was the ledger I found. I called Dr. Miriam Coyle, a religious historian at Bowdoin College, and told her what I'd found. She went quiet after I read her the name. St. Augustine's Seminary. Finally, she said, "My grandmother grew up in Bangor. She always said if a girl went missing, they'd say she was taken to the seminary to have the badness burned out. I thought it was just a ghost story. But this wasn't folklore. It was infrastructure. An entire institution built to contain something they didn't understand, or didn't want the rest of us to. The hollow doctrine wasn't a theory. It was a system. And every sign suggests it worked. Which begs the question, what were they trying to hollow out? It wasn't just that they disappeared. It's that no one remembered they were ever there. In the basement archives of the Diocese of Portland, dusty file drawers no one had opened since Nixon, I found a single photograph labeled St. Augustine Graduating Class, 1844. 12 girls in modest gray dresses, hands folded, staring just left of the camera like they were being watched from over the shoulder. Every face had the same expression. A strange mix of placid and vacant, as if someone had told them to smile but never explained why. No names were written on the back. Only numbers, Roman numerals etched faintly in pencil. 1 to 3, V8, and so on. I compared it to another photograph dated 1845. Same room, same angle. And that's when I noticed it, 4 of the girls are identical. Not just similar, identical. Same haircut. Same fixed gaze. Same slight tilt of the head. As if the image had been recopied, repainted, or replicated. I kept digging. The diocese files were sparse, but one thing kept surfacing: letters. Letters from the girls, supposedly written home to family, all preserved by a nun named Sister Moira, who'd been tasked with correspondence. Here's the first, dated May 1845. Dearest Mother, the air here is so clean. I am learning to be quiet. Father Sterling says I am shedding my noise. I am nearly hollow, and that is a holy thing. The next letter, same date, different sender. Dearest Mother, the air here is so clean. I am learning to be quiet. Father Sterling says I am shedding my noise. Word for word. Identical letters signed by different girls. I showed the copies to Dr. Coyle. Her response chilled me more than the letters themselves. It's not just that they were forced to write that. It's that they might not have known they were repeating it. Then I found her. Tess Whitcomb, 92 years old, resident of a memory care home in Kittery. Her great-aunt, Lillian Whitcomb, was supposedly sent to St. Augustine in 1901, well after it had supposedly shut down. Tess only remembered fragments, but when I mentioned the hollow doctrine, her hands began to tremble. She scratched at her neck and whispered. They told her name wasn't hers anymore. Said names make noise. Said the noise feeds it. Then she looked up, eyes watery but clear. I think she wrote to us. But by the third letter, she called herself the Quiet. Just that. Nothing else. She stopped saying I. At St. Augustine's ruins, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Along the walls of the East Dormitory, under layers of mildew and ivy, were names. Dozens, carved into the stone in desperate, shaking hand. Sylvia. Agnes. Lillian. Martha. E.A. Most were scratched out. Violently. Like someone had come back and tried to erase them with fingernails or stone. In the chapel, there's a small alcove behind the altar. I forced the rotting door open and found what must have once been a prayer room. Now it's empty, except for dust and long dead candles. But here's what I can't explain. As I stood there, alone, I heard sobbing. Soft. Rhythmic. Not mechanical. Not ambient. Real. Coming from all around, but from no one. I turned on my recorder. It picked up nothing. But I swear on every breath in my lungs, someone was crying. And in the silence that followed, I understood, they didn't just lose themselves. They were taught to forget. There is no basement in the blueprints. The 1838 plans for St. Augustine's Seminary show 3 floors and an attic dormitory, no cellar, no sublevel, no tunnels. But the chapel floor sank under my boots with a different rhythm than the rest of the structure, hollow, brittle, like something too long sealed was waiting beneath. I pried up the cracked tiles behind the altar. Beneath them was a metal ring, half rusted shut, bolted into a trapdoor of stained oak. The air leaking through smelled like lavender and meat gone sour. What lay below wasn't a basement. It was a system. The ladder descended farther than it should have, 2 full minutes of careful climbing, oil lantern clenched between my teeth, until I reached a stone corridor carved from bedrock. The air was warm and wet like breath. The halls didn't make sense. I mapped them. I drew them. But when I turned back, I always returned somewhere else. I'd leave a room labeled Observation Chamber B, take 5 paces west, and find myself entering the same chamber again from the opposite side. And the rooms themselves. One had walls lined with mirrors, all slightly convex. They distorted nothing, just reflected at strange angles, and whispered in my dead grandfather's voice. You're doing this again. Another held dozens of bathtubs. Child-sized, bone-dry, with leather straps still buckled at the sides. A faded placard above the entrance read, Purity through stillness. I found a journal wedged beneath a cracked stone bench, its pages sealed with wax and twine. The ink had bloomed, but the entries were legible. The writer was a staff member, a junior educator named L. Fenwick, 1845. I applied the tincture as instructed. Laudanum, larkspur, and the doctrine water. She convulsed only briefly. No screams. No breath. They say that means it's working. Another entry. They've begun forgetting faster now. Not just names. Colors. Smells. One girl asked what a mother was. The rituals were clinical in form, but spiritual in purpose. Isolation tanks. Soundless chambers lined with velvet. Opiates dripped into mouths as prayers were whispered through keyholes. I passed a wall of carved icons, saints with mouths chiseled off, eyes inlaid with obsidian. One statue, labeled Mater Tranquillitatis, had no face at all. Just a hollow void. I turned a corner and saw a door marked Subterraneum. Heavy. Iron. The keyhole was sealed with wax that hadn't cracked in a century. As I approached, my lantern went out, not flickered, extinguished, as if snuffed between invisible fingers. I stood in total darkness for less than a minute. I know that. But it was enough. In the silence, I heard breathing. Not mine. Not human. Something slow. Wet. Curious. When I finally climbed out, gasping, caked in soil and sweat, the air in the chapel felt colder. The structure seemed slouched. Like the act of finding the subterraneum had awakened gravity in the walls. And the altar candle I lit before descending? It had been snuffed. But now it was burning again. I didn't relight it. I swear. But it burned steady, unwavering, the flame flickering against the draft. At the base of the candle was a single word, freshly carved into the wax. Again. The rot was never confined to Maine. It only began there. 3 nights ago, I went back to the archive in Augusta. The woman who let me in, Janine, the night clerk, handed me a slim folder I hadn't requested. She said it had been returned to the wrong shelf. No return address. No identifying seal. Inside, a single map, dated 1873. New England and the Northeast. Dozens of red ink circles. Each marked with initials. SSTMHODI. And coordinates. Some crossed out. Some underlined twice. At the top, a phrase written in careful block letters. Vale maintain / perimeters sanctioned. I recognized 3 of the marked sites immediately. St. Augustine's Seminary. The Lambeth site in England where Sterling was recalled from. And the ruins of Terrymore House in upstate New York, long rumored to have been an orphanage for troubled girls, that burned mysteriously in 1861. Another location matched the address of a modern juvenile correctional facility in Vermont. Still active. Still government-funded. I scanned the symbols along the margins. One kept reappearing, a closed eye, with 5 lashes above and none below. I'd seen it once before, etched into the candle base beneath the altar at St. Aloysius. A blacked-out ledger in the folder was labeled, Order of the Fifth Veil, Registrum Silentium, 1840 to 1921. Inside, names, birthplaces, suitability, scores, final disposition. One line stopped me cold. Whitcomb Lillian. Maine. Admittance approved. Transfer to ODI Boston. Hollow sequence initiated. Not only had they moved her, they tracked her. Across states. Across facilities. Each marked by the same language, the same rituals of silence, sleep deprivation, and memory purification. I traced another name through the registry. Eleanor Morrow. 1893, listed as Stage 2 complete. I recognized the surname, my own grandmother's maiden name. In a box of forgotten microfiche, I found a death certificate for a girl matching her age. Cause pulmonary failure. But the body had been buried under the wrong name. Martha Cross. My grandmother never spoke of her sister. Didn't remember her at all. In the lowest drawer of the cabinet marked Restricted, Religious Transfers, I found the ledger that laid it bare. Handwritten across the top. Authorized conversions, children referred for hollowing. Pages and pages of names. Locations. Institutions. Dozens, maybe hundreds of children, shuttled like cargo between seminaries, sanctuaries, corrective havens. Next to each entry, a mark, a small black flame, or a red seal shaped like an open mouth crossed out with thread. I took photos of every page. I drew connecting lines, pinned them to my wall. I circled the repeating names. Some locations had changed, now posing as private academies or reform centers. But the symbols, the rituals, the language, all intact. This wasn't forgotten history. It was ongoing maintenance. Late last night, someone slid a letter under my door. Handwritten, old ink. Just a single phrase. It wasn't meant to be stopped. Only passed on. The envelope had no stamp. The handwriting matched the old journal from St. Augustine. Someone alive still knows. Someone is still protecting this. And worse, someone is still choosing who gets hollowed. There were still children. Not just in records, not just in memory, alive. I found them on my second visit to the Vermont site, officially named St. Mather's Youth Correctional Facility. I posed as a grant researcher. They let me in without much trouble. The receptionist smiled the way people do when they've forgotten how to mean it. I asked for enrollment histories. I was given generic rosters. Blank-faced names. No dates of discharge. No photos. But through a broken vent cover in the admin wing, I found a service elevator, locked out of normal operation, but still powered. It descended 5 floors deeper than the building was licensed for. And there, at the bottom, Stage Prep Unit Omega. There were no guards. No need. The children inside moved slowly, if at all. They sat on metal-framed beds with blank notebooks in their laps. Some rocked gently. Others whispered prayers I didn't recognize. One girl stared at the wall, repeating, "Don't be loud. Don't be loud. Don't be loud." And at the far end, in a room marked Retention Suite, sat a boy. Maybe 10. Still lucid. A single strap undone on his chair. He looked at me like he recognized me, though we'd never met. "Are you the one who remembers?" he asked. "I think so," I said. "They said you'd come. That we all get one." He held out a folder. Inside, a single video recording. Dated 2 weeks ago. Title: Spiritual Correction Sequence 9. Subject: Ansel R. I watched it later. I wish I hadn't. Ansel was strapped to a bed under violet lighting, eyes open but not seeing. A voice recited something rhythmic, a doctrine verse, while a mechanical pulse clicked steadily in the background. A priest-like figure with no face visible leaned in and said, "You will not return. You will remain hollow." And then, the light cut. His eyes rolled up. His lips formed a word I couldn't hear. The screen went black. I asked the boy in the chair what he wanted. He didn't ask for freedom. Or family. He asked something else. "Will it matter if I get out?" The question sat in my chest like a stone. If I released the evidence, names, rituals, facilities, it would explode. Lawsuits. Investigations. Hundreds of families torn apart by the revelation that their children were taken. Some complicit. Others just blind. And survivors like this boy? Shoved into a spotlight. Poked. Prodded. Picked apart. But if I buried it, walked away, protected the boy, sealed the vaults, the system might survive in shadow. Another name. Another city. Another doctrine. There is no right choice when a monster wears 1,000 faces. Only fire. Or silence. So I chose. Back at the ruined St. Aloysius Chapel, I opened my bag and laid everything on the altar: the boy's photo, the ledger from Sterling's time, the registry with hundreds of names, the last drawing from the box. I held the match between my fingers for a long time. The boy's eyes looked back at me. So did Lillian's. And Sylvia's. And maybe even my grandmother's. And then I struck it. The flame took fast. The records curled, blistered, blackened. I didn't pray. I didn't speak. But I left the candle lit. Just one. Not for God. Not for justice. For memory. Because if we must forget, let someone remember what it cost. The official story was a gas line rupture. A fire broke out around 2:13 a.m. at the remains of St. Augustine's Seminary. Local responders described sudden ignition from beneath the chapel floor, but no source was ever definitively identified. The blaze consumed what was left of the building in under 10 minutes. The newspapers called it tragic. A historic loss. I called it efficient. No reports mentioned the sub-basement. The blueprints still say it didn't exist. No mention of the girls' names carved into the stone, the straps on the tubs, the journals wrapped in wax and secrecy. The diocese offered no comment. The Maine Historical Society issued a single-sentence statement. All remaining structures were non-essential and devoid of records. But I know what was missed. I saw them carry out an iron lockbox, charred black. The men wore civilian clothes, but moved like professionals. One whispered something as they passed, not to me, but to the box. "She'll be quiet now." They didn't see what fell from the box's underside. I did. A child's drawing, smudged but intact, for stick figure girls holding hands, beneath a triangle labeled home. No eyes. No mouths. Just hollow circles where faces should have been. In the corner, in faded pencil. We were almost done. Weeks later, the story was buried beneath campaign ads and local scandal. The ruins were bulldozed. A memorial plaque was proposed, then quietly withdrawn. The land is now under review for public repurposing. I tried to follow up with Dr. Coyle. Her office was cleared out. Phone disconnected. Bowden denies she ever taught there. Tess Whitcomb passed away. Her obituary listed no surviving family. But I found a locket in the package she left for me at the front desk. Inside, a photo of a young girl with her name scratched out. And behind it, a tiny scrap of paper. The doctrine is silence. The hollow is forever. I've spent weeks trying to put everything together. The maps. The ledgers. The registries. And yet, every time I go back to my notes, something's missing. A name I was sure I circled. A phrase I thought I copied. Pages blank where writing should be. I've started talking less. Sleeping longer. I caught myself referring to my own reflection as her. Last night, I dreamed of stairs that spiraled inward, not down, as if folding into a smaller version of themselves. At the center stood the Mater Tranquillitatis statue. Only this time, her face was mine. I tried to send the evidence to a journalist in Boston. The envelope was returned. No recipient at this address. Addressee unknown. I still have the locket, the child's sketch, and the wax-sealed page from the ledger that I never dared to open. I buried them under the foundation of a church that still stands. Not St. Augustine, one far from Maine, from history, from names like Blaine and Morrow and Wickham. I chose the place carefully. I picked one already marked on the old map. Already underlined. Because this doesn't end. They don't burn everything. They leave enough behind. Just enough to rebuild. I wasn't supposed to find this. But someone always does. And each time, the doctrine waits, quiet, patient, hollow. Because silence isn't the absence of noise. It's the shape something leaves behind after it's been forgotten.